Hello and welcome to the second in a new series of online policy seminars hosted by the Economic Research Forum based in Cairo. My name is Romesh Vaitilingam and I'm an economics writer based in the UK and one of the founding editors of ERF's policy portal, The Forum, which was launched in October 2017. So the Forum is an online platform for research-informed policy discussion on economic, social and political developments in the Middle East and North Africa. And we publish 2 or 3 columns each week, which are announced in a weekly newsletter to several thousand subscribers. This year, we have been especially prolific, publishing a number of significant columns on key issues facing the region, focusing on the impact of COVID-19, the impact of the dramatic fall in the oil price, and the economic crisis in Lebanon. So this webinar is the second in a new ERF initiative for research-based policy debate. And we're lucky enough to have 2 very distinguished speakers, both of whom have contributed to ERF and the Forum in many ways. Both of our speakers, Rabah Arezki and Rania Al-Mashat, are ERF research fellows and founding contributors to the Forum. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Rabah to start the proceedings, but let me just give you a brief introduction to him and to Rania. They're going to be speaking on the broad theme of the way forward from COVID. So Rabah is Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank and a Senior Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Before that, he was Chief of the Commodities Unit in the IMF's Research Department and a Research Fellow at Brookings. So Rabah has contributed several columns to the Forum, most recently on the dual shock of the pandemic and the fall in oil prices, and on fiscal policy and a new social contract in the region, which I'm sure that things that he will be touching on during the course of his presentation. And Rabah, I think you're going to shoot for about 15-minute presentation, then we'll come to Rania, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So we'll look forward to hearing from you. If you can unmute yourself, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be with you, Romesh, and Rania, who is an old colleague from the IMF and as a distinguished guy as a minister. Delighted to share the panel with her. And of course, thanks to the ERF and sharing for all the good work that's been done to foster the. Really impressed, and we are lending all the support we can, and we should do more. Thank you very much. So so I'll be brief. This is a long presentation that I'm happy to share through the ERF network. But really the big picture aspect of the presentation is to try and compare and contrast the situation of advanced developed economy and our region, and do that by looking at a structure that follows a chronological order. So before COVID, during COVID, and post COVID. So I'll be pretty brief and scant, but hopefully that can trigger an interesting discussion. So really, and really common sense type of advice, but I think always worth repeating. Also, I must say, internally at the bank, we've been having important discussion around the issue. This is really a time when we focus on the health response and the situation in the region, but also in the US and in Latin America, really call for, we're not out of the wood, and really call for doing whatever it takes on the health response and stay the course there. And while doing that, also preserve and protect consumption and production capability. There, I'll make the case that financing needs puts us in a very different situation than in advanced economy. And so looking forward, really, there've been talks in the region about fiscal consolidation, too premature in my judgment, but yet this really calls into question our ability to deploy the relief in ways that really reach the intended targets. And there, I think the issue of leakages defined broadly is absolutely one that's central, and we can come back to that. So chronological structure following, and so pre-COVID, no surprise, 2019 was a year of protest, people taken to the street across the region, reminiscent of 2011. So really a region that in many ways in transition, political and economical transition, but stuck in many respects. And the low social and fiscal buffers with which the region arrived at the crisis make it even more difficult to tackle that enormous and unique crisis. In addition, very polarized labor market and confinement measure are really have really taken a toll on inequality and poverty in an already very dual society, labor market, and that's true also of the US and other advanced economy, but very much more acute in our region. And a point that's dear to me and to my colleague is really the agenda on fair competition. We in the advanced world, we're all worried, in debating the US economy, European economy, about the risk of zombie firms emerging from that crisis, the Japan scenario. But really in the region, we came to this crisis with a zombie problem, with a number of SOEs really being a drag on the budget, but also on the economy as a whole, with a lot of crowding out effect. And that really also has limited the ability for that new tide of innovation and that private sector response to take the lead as the coffers are emptying from lower oil prices. So really a pre-COVID a situation that didn't augur well, but the region still did surprisingly well in trying to do whatever it takes with the limitation I'm gonna articulate. So the dual shock, we've talked over and over about this dual shock, the incredible collapse in oil prices, and the unique aspect of COVID, the supply and demand feedback loop, which are distinguishing this shock from the one of both the great financial crisis and the Great Depression. But again, so this requiring more relief than stimulus per se, at least in the onset of the crisis. But what I think is also missed is really the uncertainty layer that comes with that COVID crisis, and the moment we are now, the idea that we are going to face a second wave is, I think, is too premature. We're still stuck in that first wave in many respects, including in some advanced economy like the US. So really a unique crisis in that it originates from really that pandemic drives a supply shock that has then many demand spillover, but also at that layer of uncertainty regarding the mutation of the virus, the way it spreads. So lots of unknown, lots of uncertainty, and that's over determining what's happening on the economy. So really a unique crisis, and one that it's difficult to handle with the standard reasoning, the standard thinking we had of the other crises. So these two shocks are distinct, yet they're very much intertwined. So we went in many countries from the blanket instrument to the more targeted instrument, and this links very much to the point I was trying to make about the importance of addressing leakages. Leakages, whether it's outright capture or issues of monopolization in various sectors, including on imports. So really the importance of reaching the intended target of the program, and while one can understand the need to come to this crisis with reassuring packages, reassuring markets, reassuring the limits on what countries can deploy, especially in our region, really call for much more targeted measure as we go. So the region has reacted promptly with most countries, I would say, having lockdown measure in spite of the informality that's prevalent, and that's making this lockdown situation unsustainable. We've got border closing, but also a number of economic instruments were deployed, including lowering taxes, delaying payments of electricity bills, and so on, and targeted cash transfer also were deployed. So the region has moved fast in spite of the limited fiscal buffer it has. So I'll go quickly, but really the region has been hit directly through the health consequences of that crisis, but also, of course, indirectly through capital outflows, the disruption of supply chain, including for equipment, basic equipment at the onset of the crisis, where they were hoarding of these equipment, but also worries about food hoarding. So obviously the oil price collapse, tourism, very important for Egypt and other countries in the region, and fall in remittances. We had quantified the economic cost using different forecasts. I won't go through that. So really a crisis that seems to have triggered 14th century solution in an era where we have modern information. So really testing I would say the public sector strategic capability and the ability for countries to mobilize the private sector, mobilize the scientific community to try and articulate a strategic response. So we've seen the number of Asian countries which were previously affected by similar pandemic like SARS and others who were quite ready for that type of targeted intervention and confinement measure, as well as contact tracing. So it seems, in addition to their initial level of state capability, it seems they also had learned quite a bit from previous episodes. I would argue also that some parts of Africa who were faced with the pandemic also had the immediate type of response of measures of cleanliness, of distancing that were learned from the previous episode. So, and then of course we have the different scenario emerging when comparing Europe and the US. So that really is a crisis that has exposed the ability for the state to respond in a strategic manner, mobilize the scientific community, take advice, and react promptly. And really the confinement measure, the lockdown, were designed to buy time. Some countries have interpreted the lockdown as some sort of a permanent measure, and some have sat on their hand. That really is was not the spirit of the lockdown. That was really a precautionary measure intended to build that more targeted measures of masking, testing, and contact tracing. So I'll go quickly, but of course the challenge that are emerging now is going to be on the pricing of medicine, patenting issues, the access to the potential vaccine that may come on stream maybe hopefully next year. So tons of issues for developing countries that would require this time around not country level solution, but coordinated solution at the regional and global level. There's a number of antiviral that the region has seemed to have favor, like the chloroquine. So many countries like Morocco, Algeria have bought stocks of that. Even so, these were not proven, tested in randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and These were their immediate reaction. We now know more about the efficacy of these. And it seems other antiviral are emerging as better, but of course the prospect of a vaccine is the better prospect. Yet a further removed one, it takes usually a year or so to get to deploy this vaccine. And at the moment, the US and some European pharmaceutical company are leading with, I think, over 100 tests being performed on vaccine. So the question about the private sector incentive and the access of developing countries to that vaccine is going to be a huge issue down the road. But of course, we should prepare and anticipate, and I think the work of international organization in creating that global platform and financing some of these access to vaccine and other equipment is central. I'll go quickly, but clearly the advanced economy that borrow in their own currency and are considered a safe asset can do whatever it takes, both on the health and the fiscal front, and of course on the monetary front also. The management of liquidity has been exceptional, with risk, prospect of risk that may emerge in terms of inflation or raising taxes. For the region, again, arriving at that crisis with limited buffers, both social and fiscal buffer, makes the option of financing rather limited. Raising taxes would not be an option. Borrowing from abroad, as Egypt did, is to the extent that rates are moderate, is the right option, and many, Jordan as well, have Saudi and other GCCs have borrowed on the international market. But for countries that arrive to this crisis with large foreign currency denominated debt, the potential pressure that this crisis is putting on the exchange rate could lead to a fatal currency mismatch. So some country could borrow, create this financing space, and deploy these much needed resources for relief, but others are just in the midst of a major crisis like Lebanon, or just can't borrow, and the international community there should and can play an important role. So I'll wrap up this section, the post-COVID section, quickly. Prospect about inflation would very much depend on what's happening to the production side relative to the demand side. So clearly, lots of precautionary saving. People are not spending the way they used to, and their disposable income is going down. So clearly, we've got a lower demand, lower production. So it is not clear. And when looking at inflation in the region, it's not clear what the prospect for inflation would be. But clearly, for countries like Lebanon and others that have had to where the currency depreciated massively, imported inflation has led to even instances of hyperinflation. In some cases, Iran as well is also in a similar circumstances. But where we look at countries that have maintained their anchor on their exchange rate, the inflation has remained moderated so far, and the unemployment pool is likely to rise. There would be a lower reservation wage, but there'll be also pressure for higher pay and some push for this type of health and universal social layers are likely also to be a countervailing forces driving the cost of employment higher. So I'll touch on this issue of I think of this important theme for the region, which is rebuilding as new. So clearly we arrive at this crisis with a number of elements of the structure of the economy that was not allowing for the development of a genuine private sector, which was accessing market and credit in ways that that could rebalance the structure of the economy. So large SOEs, sometimes so connected firms, and that environment very much was frustrating many youth arriving into the labor market. So clearly this crisis has raised a number of big questions, and for the region, a big question is how do we think about this as an opportunity to rebuild as new? And I think the region is delaying what is even inevitable rebalancing of what is a fragmented social protection system into a more universal type of social layer that would be inclusive of all, and move away from that dual labor market, dual society, but at the same time to create the type of more efficient economy. We would need the kind of competition apparatus that the region has on the books, but is not necessarily the one that is truly taking on element of limited market contestability. And SOEs, for instance, state-owned enterprise, are really in the midst of that transformation. They are a large pool of employment, and there is resistance to reforming them, to put them in a competitively neutral situation. And there are obviously connected firms that also are monopolizing sectors, including the import sector. And there are, for several countries, there are also elements of the macro stance that is important to adjust, including overvalued exchange rate that subsidize imports, then lead to this capture of imports, and as a result, leading to lobby against domestic production. And of course, of the orientation of the finance sector driving finance to lend to the government or lend to import service activities, as opposed to lending to small and medium enterprise. So really, the need to rebuild as new is everywhere a theme, but for the region, this rebalancing of the economy, this renewal of the social contract is, I think, precipitated by this dual shock. And I'll end by a word on supply chain. So really, the rethink is also on the rewiring of supply chain globally, a move away, at least in terms of rewiring from China. So the Mediterranean neighborhood could benefit from what I would call a Euromed type of rewiring of this supply chain, recentering around Europe. So there would be opportunities for FDI for the region to tap into this reconfiguration. The crisis has just made that strategic rivalry between China and the US, and the potential recentering around Europe and its neighborhood more pressing. So the region needs to do quite a bit, including on the competition agenda, to be attractive to these FDI, and of course the digital economy. This crisis has shown that the region, which has ventured into improving its connectivity on payment, on internet, but not quite at the speed that it should. And of course, it could have had consequences, this delay in the adaptation of some firm into that COVID era, where people are working a lot from home. So clearly, the COVID has really brought back this agenda on digital transformation for the region at the center. There are complex issues on the 5G and the strategic rivalry between US and China that will reverberate in the region, but clearly a huge opportunity for platforms to emerge, to disrupt logistic, transportation chain, and create more opportunity for trading services across the region and globally. And of course, the long-standing issue of debt is going to be tremendously important. Many countries will have to structure the debt, and obviously the need for financing the response medium term are going to call for again a renewed effort of the international community to help with debt relief. But again, the countries in the region will have to do their part, and their part, I think, is really the eradication of leakages, corruption issues, transparency, and the demonopolization of sectors that are preventing also the setting off this recovery from a growth perspective. I will stop here, and I hope I was not too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabah, for that introduction. A lot of stuff to talk about there. Let me remind people listening in that you can put questions. Some people have already been doing that in the chat. The other way is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can go to the participants list and click on raise hand, and we can bring you in live to ask your question to our speakers. Anyway, let's turn to our second speaker now. I'm absolutely delighted to have Rania Al-Mashat join us. Rania is Minister for International Cooperation in the Egyptian government. And before that, she was Minister of Tourism. She's long been involved with ERF. She's worked with the IMF and the Central Bank of Egypt, and was actually a founding contributor, wrote 2 very early articles on economic policy management for the forum. So Rania, pleasure to have you here, and look forward to hearing your comments. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be joining everyone today. I have lots of great memories with ERF. It was my first summer internship in 1994. When ERF was just being launched with Dr. Heba Handousa. And the first time I met Rabah was actually at the ERF before we became colleagues at the IMF a while ago. So I'm very pleased to be here. I have a presentation as well. I promise to be shorter than Rabah, so we can give some opportunity for Q&A. But I wanted to touch on a few things. The name of the presentation is Rebuild for a Resilient Recovery. And the contents, or what I want to be able to cover with you. In Egypt, we have done 3 sort of things related to COVID. The first is protect. If we can just go to the next slide. No, the one before, yeah. So protect the population from the spread of the virus, provide, that's through easier access to credit to help households smooth consumption, and then provide liquidity for firms to survive the disruption, and then progress by expediting structural reforms through and beyond COVID. And I'll touch upon these a little bit, but given that we're talking about post-COVID for the region, so the first part, I will talk about the post-pandemic, what we call Great Reset, and I'll explain what that means. And then on Egypt, there's the response and rebuild. And there we have initial conditions. We entered this with a certain economic variables at hand, monetary and fiscal policy responses. And then there's a silver lining that I'll speak about, and policies related to women. Then as Ministry of International Cooperation, given a lot of what's happening in the debate on multilateralism, etc., what are we doing with what I call economic diplomacy? And there we have multi-stakeholder platforms, global partnership narrative, an ODA SDG mapping, and then finally a decade of action to deliver on the SDGs. So this is sort of the top. This presentation will be available for everyone. Nonetheless, I'll try and breeze through this in case there are questions. When we take a look at a post-pandemic for the MENA region, I'm part of a stewardship board with the World Economic Forum that includes public sector representatives, so different ministers from different countries in the region. It also includes private sector companies, CEOs from the region. And in that stewardship board, we came out with a regional action group, and the key has to do with what is known as the Great Reset. So the pandemic has proven, and all of us are witnessing this as citizens of the world, that there is no border for this crisis. No country has been isolated. As Rabah showed in his presentation, there is actually a dual impact on the region because of also what's happening with respect to oil prices. We also have, so the price volatility has affected different markets with disproportionate impacts on regional economies. We also have particular sectors which were hard hit: tourism, entertainment, retail, and of course, some of the existing societal and economic issues in the region, particularly in some of the conflict areas, definitely compounds the impact. So this is just the outset. Now, when we're thinking about post-COVID, we need to have some fresh thinking, and the fresh thinking, or sort of what I always say is, this crisis has pushed all of us to innovate, whether you're private sector, your government, or your civil society, or you're just a regular person at home. This crisis has pushed all of us to think how to stay safe, how to quickly create a policy response, how to coordinate with each other, whether in government or private sector or so forth. So there are what we call stakeholder engagement, building resilience for the MENA countries. And these are based on 4 principles: accelerating inclusive economies and societies, shaping a new vision for economic integration, harnessing the 4th industrial revolution, and promoting environmental stewardship. And this touches a little bit on some of the points that were presented as challenges that Rabah highlighted. But here it's like, how do we address these challenges in a way that mobilizes both public-private partnerships and puts everyone involved in a certain framework? These links here on this slide have the detailed the detailed text of these articles. But if we take each one of them separately, and of course the idea of these 4 principles is, once they are activated and done, because every country on its own has basically tried to address each one of the 4 principles. And if we are able to put this in a framework, a regional framework, we will be able to reshape societies and economies in a way so that we become more resilient going forward. So if we go to the stakeholder engagement and these 4 principles, the first one has to do with inclusive economies and societies. And when we think about them, it's really to try and see how we can create labor market policies to simulate job creation. Something else which is extremely important related to reskilling and upskilling the labor force, because we've seen that certain skills have come to be very important, others not so much. Which fiscal policies can be used to provide for the social safety nets to support vulnerable groups, and of course, try and address women issues or women empowerment issues. And when all of these are going to be seen later on when I talk about the Egypt case, because for each of these principles, in our situation, we have been able to address several of them. So as we take each of these principles and see what different countries have done, if they are put in a regional context, this can create a lot of scale up and leverage. The next one has to do with shaping a new vision for economic integration. All of us know from the many writings and publications of the ERF that intra-trade is extremely small in value. When we look at the MENA region, it's around 16% compared to 62% in other regions, Asia or the European Union. And what is very important here is through public-private collaboration, we can actually address some of the institutional and regulatory issues that actually need to help more integration in the region. And that has to do a little bit with the free competition and more accessibility that was mentioned in Rabah's presentation as well. If we go to the next one, 4th industrial revolution has to do with our ability to create a digital transformation. And what we've seen is that over the past 4 months, the amount of work that has been done online is just unprecedented. So it's as if you've brought the next 15 years right now. And therefore, how can we also capitalize on this? We have seen that there is a very tech-savvy youth population. We do see that even public servants that were very used to bureaucratic ways of doing work have been able to work at home. Many of these services have been done online, purchasing and so on. So this is a very important aspect of the crisis. Fourth, something else which is quite important, with all the fiscal stimuli that are happening globally, how do we ensure that these projects are actually environmentally sustainable and help create a green recovery? So this is also a very important principle. So that is when I'm thinking about the MENA region. These are four very important topics. When I take a look at the Egypt case, and I will be able to translate those four pillars or those four principles into things that we have done on the ground. And first, let me characterize the initial conditions. We entered this crisis with strong fiscal and foreign exchange buffers. And that's, of course, because Egypt had done a very comprehensive program with the IMF between 2016 and 2019. So we entered this crisis with strong fiscal and foreign exchange buffers. The government did not impose a full lockdown, but there was partial lockdown. There were different curfews that were imposed. Remote working access for public and private sector were encouraged. And in a very big public sector, as in Egypt, with more than 4 million employees, actually people were working from home. And this was extremely novel in terms of experimenting with how that can take place. And it did take place, and it has been very efficient. Increasing strategic food reserves was also quite important. And then finally, of course, on June 26, we signed a standby agreement with the IMF. So this is sort of just a few of the points that I wanted to mention on Egypt. Now, here's a long list of fiscal as well as monetary measures that the government has taken to tackle early on the crisis. Maybe a few things that I just want to highlight. It had to do with because of the point related to leakage that was mentioned earlier. This stimulus was very targeted. So you have sectors such as tourism, which were addressed. You had small and medium enterprises to ensure that their interest, the interest rates imposed on them were quite favorable. The real estate taxes were delayed. So there's a whole host of measures, both on the fiscal side and the monetary side, which try to help push mitigate the impact, as I mentioned early on, with respect to household liquidity as well as firms. And I don't want to go through all the details. This is for everyone to read and go through. But then comes the issue related to inclusivity of societies and the vulnerable groups. And this is what I call the silver lining in this crisis. And this has to do with four important issues. One has to do with mitigating the impact on the unorganized labor, and this is the informal sector, putting forward a social protections and social safety net agenda, expediting financial inclusion and the digital reform agenda, and then leading on women. Just very quickly, because of time, for example, on the informal sector, we've been able to put 1.5 million workers onto the register of, because there was a monetary compensation that was given to them. So this was extremely important, and a database has been created. So that was something which is very, very important. When we take a look at the social safety net, because with the international partners, we have had successful programs on social safety nets that was easily scaled up. So more families were added, and also pensions were increased. So this is all to mitigate the social economic implications through social protection and social safety agenda. When it comes to financial inclusion, that was a very, very important tool so that people could actually get access. And here the central bank lifted some of the regulations and expedited some of the regulations that were there. And this is why when we say expediting the structural reform agenda, this is what took place in many cases. And that's why when I say this crisis pushed us all to innovate and coordinate more fast, we have seen this on the ground. And then we come next to the gender parity. Egypt is the first country in the world actually to have a dedicated rapid response for women from COVID. And this was picked up by the UN Women. We have a policy tracker that takes a look at government's policy related to women, and that is updated on a monthly basis. And then I would like to mention here that with the World Economic Forum and with the National Council of Women, Egypt is the first country in the Middle East and Africa to actually launch Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator. And this is also a private-public platform where we try to address the participation of women in the labor market, the access of women to more leadership positions, and also the equal pay. And this is a program which is for 3 years. We don't do it alone as the public, but we also have private sector representatives. So the details of this will be announced next Wednesday, and maybe we can have a session separately on that. But this is an extremely important platform, so that also mobilizing international resources related to the women agenda is going to be extremely timely and supportive. Now comes a part on international cooperation, what I call economic diplomacy. And for those who don't know what the Ministry of International Cooperation does, I put here our mandate, and I don't want to go through I don't want to go through them in detail, but again, all Egypt's economic relationships with the outside world, excluding the IMF, is something that we do as the Ministry of International Cooperation. Also obtaining external financing, the grants, what we call development financing, monitoring with the national agency the use of this money and making sure that disbursements and so on are going in line. And then of course our relationship with the United Nations. So this is the mandate. If I put this into a very brief vision, we try to strengthen our inclusive multilateral engagement with development partners, governments, global policymakers, private sector, civil society, to effectively deliver the 2030 national agenda, which is consistent with the UN development goals. And all of this, of course, because we want to create a circular economy. And actually Egypt has, I mean, this was announced last week, we are what is known as a grow economy within the circular report. It's about circular economies, and this is something that pleased us, and we are working even more to strengthen that. If I go into the elements of economic diplomacy, here I mentioned 3 things. First is multi-stakeholder platform, and what we try to do here is to push the frontiers of multilateralism through prioritizing a green recovery through public partnerships. How do we do this? The ministry has been actually hosting, and this is extremely important. We launched in April what we call the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Here we convene all our development partners, whether multilateral or bilateral, and we try to strengthen our partnership, make sure that it's more results oriented. We want to make sure that there's alignment, harmonization, and complementarity between what different development partners are doing, so that we actually maximize impact. It also provides an extremely important opportunity where we try and understand and where the successes have been and where any shortcomings or pitfalls have been, so we avoid them in the future. What have we done so far? We've hosted jointly with other line ministries important platforms where the minister comes for the sector, provides a presentation on not just what has been accomplished, but also the future prospects of the sector and the financing needs. And that's very, very important now as we're talking about post-COVID, and as international resources are becoming, I don't want to say scarce, but there's this competition over international resources. So you need to be, as a country, ready to provide exactly what you need, how it impacts people, what the projects are viable. And this platform has created a fantastic opportunity where key sectors have been able to present their case. We've done it with agriculture, we've done it with public enterprises, and we've done it with transportation, and in the works we have irrigation, and we have housing, and we have the other sectors coming up. So this has been extremely important, and it also talks about how we assess ODA financing. This is just a few examples of also where different partners of development have come in to actually provide different, participate collectively in different projects, which have been quite useful. I don't want to go over them, but this is just to give you examples of these different projects. Some of them have been related to health, like the one that we have done with USAID and the Egyptian Red Crescent. The other one has to do with women and helping women in Upper Egypt that have been producing the masks. So this was also a very good collaboration with UNDP and one of our very leading civil society company, civil society organizations, and NIDAء, which is actually founded by Dr. Hiba Handousa. So we always thank her for her hard work, whether at ERF or even after that. And then all of this comes to the next point, which is very, very important, and that's global partnership narrative. So we're doing all of this work, but in today's world, where you need to very, convincingly tell your story, what we want to do is everything that we collaborate on, we want to be able to provide a narrative around it. We want to be able to mobilize people around it and give a good story. Egypt's development story has been one which is robust, one which is important, and one that has affected lots of lives and lots of beneficiaries through different projects and with different SDGs in the forefront. So how do we put all of this story together? And this is where our global partnerships narrative has come up. It's an opportunity to create purposeful and meaningful connections with our audience that lead them to endorse our work, but also advocate it. And this is extremely important because we have a young population. And today, everyone is very worried that SDGs will be forgotten and everyone will be sidetracked. So we want to pull everyone again to the development story. And that's where our narrative comes in. And it's actually P and P and P. It's people, projects, purpose. And as you can see, these ands are 17 colors of the SDGs. So this is done in a very meaningful way. The next is when we take a look at people, people are at the core of any of our financing or any of our projects or any of the cooperation that happens with our multilateral or bilateral partners. And then we have projects in action. So our projects have actually been implemented in multiple sectors: education, transportation, water desalination, renewable energy, entrepreneurship, women empowerment, etc. Next is a purpose has been the driver for each of the projects. We do have an SDG at its heart, or even more, and all of this is extremely important in creating that story. Comes next is ODA SDG mapping framework, and this is again how do we assess the financing that has been mobilized with our development partners. And here comes the idea of mapping the ODA financing to be able to show, everybody knows that in 2030 countries will want to tell how many of the SDGs they have been able to meet, etc. And here what we want to do is take an approach where each of the the financing that happens from our different partners we are able to speak about and talk about and actually account for in terms of SDGs. So next comes identifying the project purpose, then the SDG definition, mapping it to the different project that's taking place, and then looking at the cross-cutting themes. So this is an exercise. We finished our initial step. We are doing this collectively with all our development partners, and ODA financing is what the Ministry of International Cooperation is responsible for. It is part of the full financing. And here is, again, based on the methodology that we've been doing with our development partners, we've been able to take the portfolio that we are responsible for as Ministry of International Cooperation, actually split it up into the different SDGs based on the projects that we have been doing. And this will become available to everyone once the exercise is concluded. And then let me conclude with just one last thing, which is there's a decade of action to deliver on the SDGs. Everybody's so worried, and there have been so many calls that COVID is going to make everyone forget about the SDGs. But what it has proven, this crisis, is that each one of the 17 affects each one of us individually, whether it's on health, whether it's on clean water, whether it's on education, infrastructure, sustainable cities, etc. All of them affect each one of us, and achieving them requires both global as well as local responses. But we have to be very mindful of them and have them at the fore of our consideration. And next is in the last SDG report, Sustainable Development Report 2020. This is basically the result of how Egypt has been doing in terms of the 17. So we're keeping a very close look at this, so that in our new projects with our development partners, we're able to address them in a more tangible, substantive way. Egypt has been doing very good on renewable energy. We've got a few prizes on that. On women empowerment, we're also doing many things, and the accelerator will help on achieving more, or moving faster towards achieving our strategy on women empowerment. So there's plenty going on. I just wanted to give everyone an idea and maybe just conclude on a positive note. COVID is definitely a humanitarian challenge, but we continue as policymakers and as a community to be hopeful and helpful. Egypt is not new to crises and has shown resilience over the past decade. And we believe through our multilateral and bilateral partnership and development story that we showcase with our new narrative, PNP, we will be able to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rania. Another fantastic presentation. So we started a little bit late, so we'll run over a little bit to have time for questions. So we'll have about 15 minutes now. There's quite a lot of questions coming in the chat and in the Q&A that our two speakers might want to look at and point to, and anyone can add to that, or if you want to raise your hand and join us live, please do feel free to do that. Rabah, let me come to you. There are probably things in Rania's presentation that you'd like to respond to. In the chat, there's questions about your point about postponing fiscal consolidation. And so a question about how do you do that in countries with limited fiscal space, for how long, how far, and how do you do it? How much public debt can central banks buy? What role might sovereign wealth funds play? And also a question about the World Bank and the role that it might play in rebuilding the trust that you need to make your plan effective. Do you want to pick up on those and maybe some of the things in Rania's remarks?
Yeah, no, so Rania did a fantastic presentation, and it shows how much she's been leading the way on really articulating a vision for the next decade. I would add that I think what's particularly important in rebuilding trust, to take your last question, is really the ability that we as World Bank, but also the authorities, in trying to insufflate that sense of a need for rebalancing, for a need of transformation, and get that economic debate to really transcend just the elite, in the administration and the Ministry of Finance. So the ERF is really, in that respect, a great a gem for the region in that respect, and so. On transparency, on data availability, Egypt has made quite a bit of progress, and it's done quite a bit. It's doing a lot on SOEs, on disclosure issues, trying to make them competitively neutral. I think that's the area where I see where we could bridge the gap between that urgency of the rebalancing, the urgency of having that new universal layer of social protection, coupled with a pool of demand for a private sector that pool pull this aspiration for good jobs, or bring people in for good jobs. So that, I think, that aspiration for rebalancing, that vehiculating the sense that this is not a top-down job, but really a transformation that is for everybody to participate in, including in the open debate about it, is, I think, an important aspect of how we rebuild trust. Of course, transparency is at the core of that. On fiscal policy, we published a recent piece on the forum on the issue of addressing the leakages. So clearly, fiscal consolidation in the midst of a crisis, whether raising taxes or cutting spending, would not be appropriate. But I really feel what is not at the moment well understood is that while we would want to spend money on relief, it is important that this relief reaches the intended target. And one could think about the way one can think of a limited fiscal pace as an opportunity to really limit these leakages, create fiscal space by reducing corruption, by really having targeted program, demonopolizing sectors. So really that would create an enormous amount of fiscal space. It requires courageous and bold reform, but you also require rethinking processes. And Rania talked about the digitalization of the administration. Some countries have moved to blockchain. I noted the example of Colombia, which has moved a lot of the transaction through blockchain. So all that agenda on transparency would amount to also reducing a lot of the leakages in the system would make the relief reach its intended target. It will also create space, fiscal space where there isn't. But most importantly, I would say the reduction of leakages rather than an outright cut that some would advocate is also better at setting off the recovery. And the reason are simple is if there is a lot more demonopolization, if we can free up the lobbies and the monopolies of imports of food, of fuel, of a number of sector and reduce their ability to not only charge the government or charge the consumer higher prices, one could then also allow for more space for SMEs, others to come in and create the potential production domestically that we aspire to, and the jobs that are associated with them. So in thinking of delaying fiscal consolidation as something that is anathema, it really is on the what really countries would need to do to get more debt restructuring, to get the support for from the international community is going to be to try and do the homework when it comes to this limiting of leakages, which is the right way to prepare for growth. And I haven't seen really at the moment this articulated clearly in many of the debates. It's either demanding more funding or versus consolidating. I think there's a middle ground there, and the middle ground is for that addressing of leakages as the way to create fiscal space and set of growth. I also noted a point for Mohsin Khan, my mentor and good friend. Indeed, Saudi Arabia is clearly has clearly large buffer and could indeed tap into its reserve or its sovereign reserve. But they did go to the market, and I suspect this is for liquidity management. But still, one could argue that the commitment they made to not Saudi Arabia but others, the commitment they made to not touching sovereign wealth fund and keep that for future generation is maybe an appropriate way to honor that commitment. Bahrain, Oman went to the market with higher borrowing cost. It's the market, the bond market is responding well. I noted also that in the US, even so the Treasury was offering credit facilities. It was not tapped into, at least as much as they had hoped for. And the reason is because they could go to the bond market and raise a lot of money in anticipation for what could be dire time to come. So there could be that strategic behavior, realizing that the bond market is responding well to these issuances, and as a result, you want to build your own buffer by borrowing. and basically smooth out the situation that could be a second wave or other more difficulty coming down the road. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Rabah. Rania, a couple of the things that you touched on in your presentation were about gender parity and about the informal sector, and we've got a couple of questions of those in the Q&A. One asks, what can be done to improve private sector conditions to promote more women's employment there? And on the informal sector, what can governments do to give informal organizations in the informal sector the incentives to join the formal sector? And there's a question specifically on Egypt and your kind of international focus. What do you see as Egypt's primary comparative advantage to attract such investments, particularly at a time like this when we're perhaps seeing a tendency toward deglobalization? A few things for there. Choose what you like to respond to.
I'll try and be as fast as possible, but I think that when the dust settles, what people will remember are countries that have been able to give a good story in terms of how they manage the crisis, and also countries that have not been completely consumed by COVID itself, but actually looked beyond it. And that's what we here as a government have been collectively, each one in their field, really doing in a very coordinated way. So for example, we, and this is, everyone has to keep this in mind. There's no right and wrong, and there's a lot of learning by doing that this crisis has taught us. But what has been, in my view, surprisingly positive is that all of us have been pushed to very quickly take action that is meaningful and can have reach. So for example, a committee to address how can we provide handouts to the informal workers. We have lots of mega projects where many people are employed, and the process of formality was not fast enough. So in our quest to provide these handouts so that people can continue purchasing and that their livelihood is not interrupted, a full database for 1.5 million informal workers has taken place. So that is something very important, and we are building on that so that we push even more of the informality into formal. So that's number one. Number two, when we talk about women empowerment, Egypt in 2017 launched its gender parity strategy, and the National Council for Women is under the auspices of the president, and he endorsed this strategy. We were the only country that announced it from the United Nations. So in the midst of COVID, there is a designated woman response, gender response for COVID, because they have been identified as one of the most vulnerable groups. I didn't want to go through the details, but it's in the presentation that will be available to everyone. And then Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator is a platform that is not just government, but it's also the private sector. So we have co-chairs from the private sector, and through them, there's going to be reached to hundreds of private sector companies, so that this strategy on 3 pillars, which are more women into the labor force, more women into leadership roles, and third, more equal pay, is going to be at the sort of propagated across. So you have a national strategy, but you have the catalyst as private sector pushing these agenda as well. And all of us know from writings at the IMF, World Bank, and so on, that women's participation is macro critical. So if more women participate, then GDP is going to grow, productivity increases, and so on. I don't want to go through all of that. When it comes to the comparative advantage of Egypt and what you do to encourage private sector, when we are trying to mobilize funds, we are not only mobilizing funds for the sovereign, but also a lot goes to the private sector. Private sector gets financing through banks, where there's support from abroad. Also, many of the projects are actually being implemented through private sector companies in Egypt. For example, if we take water desalination projects, even if the umbrella it's public-private partnership, because the implementing companies are private sector. So there are many opportunities going forward, because investments in infrastructure will continue, investments in the digital world will continue, investments in agriculture, which is an extremely important sector today, and the agribusiness is important. So all of these are opportunities which we are trying to present jointly with line ministers, so that the future sector agenda is one which is made accessible to everyone.
Great, thank you very much. So we've sadly run out of time. We could go on talking much longer, and Rania suggested maybe we have another session. So we'll maybe take you up on that, Rania, and plan one for maybe for a little later in the year, and get Rabah back also then. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the questions. This session has been recorded and will be available on the forum on the ERF website as of early next week. I'm hoping that Rabah and Rania will both be able to make their presentations available. In fact, I see that Rania's colleague has given us a link already in the chat, so that's there. Hopefully Rabah and Rania might be able to write up some of their thoughts and respond to some of your questions and pieces we can put on the forum soon. But this is, as I said, it's just the second of a whole stream of webinars that we hope to be doing on the forum, and I hope you'll be back with us then. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks again to Rania and Rabah for a fantastic conversation. See you again soon. Take care. Stay well, everybody. Bye-bye.